Do you need to pay a realtor? Should you pay a realtor? Coming up next. Hey, it's Yama. Welcome to the Section 8 Sensei. Today, we are going to go through the lawsuit against NAR and the real estate community and see how that's going to affect you in buying and selling real estate in 2024 and beyond. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and join us to learn more about how you can save some money or spend some money, just depending on how you look at it. All right, today we're going to talk about the lawsuit that's kind of turned the real estate market upside down from a real estate agent perspective as far as commissions go. So we kind of want to go through what happened, why it happened, and really how it affects both buyers and sellers now moving through the market to kind of take advantage of these rules or at least understand them so that you can operate effectively as either a seller or a buyer and know kind of where your risk and where your liability is. All right, before we get started, just kind of wanted to ask everybody, how many of you were under the impression, or maybe not the impression, but the understanding that when you went out and bought a house from a real estate agent and they represented you on the buyer side, it was kind of conveyed to you that, hey, quote unquote, my services are free because the seller pays them. I think that's kind of a, potentially a misinterpretation of what was actually happening. So in the comment section, tell me if you think it was F for free, or put a dollar sign if you think that there was a cost to that and somehow it was connected to you or it wasn't connected to you. So I think first is kind of understanding how we got here, and then it'll help to explain kind of where we're going. All right, so you can see here this whole thing started back in 2019, okay? And so you could see this Sitzer and Burnett filed this lawsuit, which then became class action, basically against everybody in the free world that mattered. And it kind of stood in the courts for a long time. You can see in that link below that text there, you can kind of see and click on that and visit that site. And that will kind of give you the basis of everything that kind of happened leading up to this point. And primarily what the plaintiffs were saying in that case was, hey, should the listing agent, and the buyer's agent be splitting commission? Should the seller bear the cost of both sides of the commission side, or should we just be responsible for our own? Now, historically, the argument with the agents has always been, hey, this number, which let's call it 6%, has always been negotiable between, the listing agent and the seller, right? So it's always been a negotiated number, but by and large, they just tell you stick the 6 in there or do whatever you're going to do. But they were accounting for both sides of the commission, and then it was up to the listing agent's broker to split that in whatever format they wanted with the buyer side agent that brought the buyer. So the whole lawsuit was basically, hey, it wasn't a disclosure lawsuit, and I think that's where a lot of the agents that I've talked to kind of misinterpreted. They're like, hey, the seller knew, the seller knew, the seller knew. Well, this was not a disclosure lawsuit, from my understanding. This was a antitrust lawsuit, which basically said, hey, there's this collusion that the seller really didn't have a choice, right? Because MLS and the real estate community has always kind of bracketed this whole thing into a seller side cost. So did they really have an option to split the numbers up? And that's really what kind of happened. And I think from my understanding, and like I said, I've just read the same information you guys have access to, but it didn't seem like, I don't think NAR and everybody else was really ready for what they brought. And once that first domino fell out in Missouri, then the wheels came off the axle and it's just started to come down like an avalanche. So that's kind of how the whole thing started. And we're going to kind of break down what came out the other side and kind of how to approach it. Okay, so like we said, the seller in most of these cases historically has agreed to pay, this 3 to 6% number that's been buried into their price of their house and comes out of their net, proceeds when they're done. And then that listing broker, splits that number with however they see fit, 3.3, 3.2, 2.5, 2.5, whatever it is. And then that commission number to the buyer side broker has been listed in the MLS. So you guys may not see it now because companies have already started to take it down, or MLS has. But back in the day before this happened, right there on the listing. So if you were on Zillow or Realtor, whatever it was, because that's an RSS feed that pulls from MLS, you would see buyer side broker commission, and you would usually see between 2 and 3% in that number. So it told the buyer side broker immediately what it was that they could expect by bringing that buyer to the transaction should they get under contract and close. All right, so the antitrust piece of this was really surrounding that the agents, they said, were conspiring to fix commissions and to raise the cost to both the buyer and the seller. So it's kind of a price fixing accusation, and that link that we've got there kind of is the court transcript for some of that stuff that you can read if you are so inclined to do so at your leisure. So the lawsuit really was about, whether the seller ever had a choice to not pay that buyer side broker. And then the other argument was, why am I paying the buyer side broker? Let the buyer pay the buyer side broker. I'll pay the listing agent. We're fine with that. Everybody will agree, and you pay them what you want to negotiate with them, whether it's, 0.5%, 1%, 3%, 5%, or whatever number you feel like. And so it kind of went down to, did the buyer's broker really ever have a way to get paid outside of the seller in the traditional sense? And with the MLS, it got drug in because it was listed there, and it was always expected that the seller was paying, something in regards to the commission numbers. So that's kind of where, a lot of this has come about, and where, there were problems in the lawsuit as far as defending that from the defense's side. So all this went down, and NAR got the shit kicked out of them to the tune of $418 million. A lot of those originally listed real estate companies were settling in the millions across the board. I heard through the grapevine that a lot of real estate agents were pissed because right before this settlement happened on this lawsuit, which they settled the case, they didn't go all the way down the rabbit hole, and that settlement was announced like literally right after all of the NAR dues were paid, which I think are about $1,000 a year, multiplied by how many hundreds of thousand real estate agents. So they basically took the real estate money from all of the memberships and didn't disclose the settlement was on the table, waited for them to pay it. And I just have had some agents basically express their dislike or not happiness or whatever the hell you want to call it with that layout. So anyway, long story short, the whole deal goes into effect and has been a shit show pretty much since the settlement occurred. So this actually takes place on August 17th of 2024. So that's when the reality starts. So all of these wheels have been in motion. Every broker's got a different set of paperwork. Every broker's got a different take. Everybody's scrambling to figure out what the answer is. But there's a couple of things that are clear. NAR got whacked with the money. The buyer side commissions already have come out of MLS. So if you go to Zillow or go to Redfin or whatever, most of these commission numbers that we were talking about that were posted there are all gone now. Now they are allowed to post the commission numbers, but they can only do it on their own personal websites or their company websites, but it's no longer an MLS publishing. So in order to find out, you either have to go to that agent's, if you're a real estate agent representing a buyer, if you want to know what the buyer side commission number is, if there is any, you got to go to their website, or you're contacting the listing agent finding out, hey, what does the seller have in this thing for me? And that's where a lot of this is going to go sideways, or has already, with some people that I've talked to. So there are now what's called buyer broker agreements, meaning that if you are a buyer out there, your real estate agent on the buyer side is going to hand you a piece of paper that says you agree to pay them X. Now, the issue is when you sign that piece of paper and they execute that piece of paper, you don't know if whatever property you're buying, you have no idea whatsoever what the seller side has in commission for the buyer side. For example, you buy a $200,000 house, you sign a buyer brokerage agreement for $6,000 or 3%. If you go buy that house and put an offer in, and on that particular house because you like it, you may have a situation where obviously the seller says, hey, I'm only paying 2%. Well, in that case, you would technically, according to the agreement, have to write a check to your buyer's agent for the $2,000 shortage that the seller is not paying within the listing agreement. So those are the things that we'll cover in a little bit here that are really important. Once that first domino fell, like I said in Missouri, then the shit hit the fan. And every lawyer out there was running class action in every single state across the United States, and were filing lawsuits as soon as that thing went down. So there's a link there. You can kind of see some frequently asked questions about what that all means, et cetera, with the settlement piece of it that NAR had. But this is going to affect how you buy and sell real estate and kind of how you approach things. So this is going to be kind of important to at least have a general understanding on how to go about your process. All right, so what we want to do here is just kind of go through both sides, meaning what does this mean for sellers? What does this mean for buyers? Because, depending on what side of the fence you're on in the transaction, this is going to affect you in a different way. So we're going to kind of go through the pluses and the minuses of each side so you know how to kind of evaluate what works best for you with your relationships and partners and transactions and whatnot. So it's definitely going to be an uncomfortable situation because I don't think all agents have dialed in how they're going to present this yet. And this is kind of that lights are coming on in the room type of thing where this is a conversation that they've never had to have before, but now this is going to be a conversation. And obviously there's a big difference between, if I go buy $1 million house and, I go and my agent finds me the house and that's fine and I'm happy and I buy the $1 million house. That's a different conversation than, hey, I'm going to show you this house. You're going to love it. Okay, great. Hey, I don't really know what's going to happen, but you got to write me a check for $30,000 depending on what the answer is. That's a whole different type of psychology in the conversation. So we want to just go through both sides so you guys have a good feel for each one and then kind of go from there. All right, so we're going to go through the seller side first. Okay, so from the seller side, what does this mean? Coming out of the chute, it's, hey, great. We're not going to have to pay the money. We should make more money now on the house. So we're happy. All right. Maybe. Okay. So the possibility of not paying commission on a transaction and netting more money is real. Okay. Now, for that to happen, because we all know that if I had a $100,000 house and all of a sudden I'm not putting 3% buyer side commission in my transaction, you and I both know that the seller's not going to go, well, since I'm not getting or having to pay that money, I'll just price my house at 97. Okay, well, that shit didn't happen. Okay, they're still pricing it at 100 either way. So they're trying to money grab the money, which is fine. Okay, so there is a possibility. Now, the only way that obviously that happens is if they get a buyer that comes in, writes a contract at whatever the offer number is, but they don't request any buyer side commission in the transaction. Now, personally, I see this where, there could be some people who are egomaniacs that just think they understand everything about real estate and they don't need a realtor and, they're discounting the value of the agent, et cetera, et cetera. But where I do see this as a potentially realistic space is where the agents could have some struggle is trying to convince investors that have done this for years, have multiple investment properties, et cetera, and trying to convince those guys those investors that they need representation when it could be argued that in the majority of transactions, they probably know enough to put it together on their own. So I think that's a space that's going to be hard for the buyer side agents is those coming from that buyer side agent, especially with the data that's out there, because it's not like, it's not like the buyer's agent typically is quote unquote finding the house that nobody knows about. Now, if that happens, you absolutely pay them. There's no question about it. But, 99 times out of 100 right now, buyers are going in, they're going to Zillow, they're sending a text to their agent and their lender and saying, hey, I just saw this house. Can you run the numbers on it and let me in? Okay. And the buyer's finding the house on their own in a lot of cases. So I think that's where the struggle, potentially could be with the investor pool. Okay. So though there's this possibility, we also don't want to get too excited on the seller side because the reality is this. Whether you pay buy side commission or you do concessions or any of whatever it is, only one thing matters, and that is what is my net proceeds going to be when I'm done doing whatever BS is going on in the contracts and seller commissions and all this other bullshit. Okay. At the end of the day, if you're selling a $100,000 house and you're paying 6% in real estate commission, you're netting $94,000. If you go out and sell a $100,000 house and you pay 6% in buyer side, concessions, right, for closing costs or whatever, you're netting $94,000. So all that matters really to the seller side, regardless of all this going on, is what offer comes to you that you're most comfortable with, i.e., hey, somebody has financing or somebody has cash or somebody's putting more money down or has hard earnest money or whatever. And what is my net at the end of the day? because the money that you're paying or the money that you're going to give as part of your contract, whether it's a concession or a commission, it's tomato, doesn't matter. Okay, it's just going to cut into your bottom line. So don't get too consumed with what it's called. Just be consumed with how much it is. All right. Now, there's obviously some options for you as a seller, depending on how experienced you are or what your feeling is on the whole listing side in general. So I know there's obviously some flat fee listing companies out there. There's some flat fee dollar representation just to get you an MLS. I mean, there's all sorts of options that you have, FSBOs, et cetera, et cetera. But remember that you still want representation, especially if you really don't know what you're doing. Okay. Again, I know there's a lot of investors that do a lot of properties. They do a lot of flips. They have a lot of experience, but there's a reason that the agent on the listing side and buyer side are licensed and they've passed tests and gotten credentials and have E&O insurance and everything else. So you've got to be very, very comfortable in order to maneuver through that landscape and, make sure that you're covering all your bases legally for both sides, especially on the disclosure side. So there's a value to all of that the agents have, and I don't want that to be lost on everybody because like I said, they do carry the license, the insurance, and everything. So the value to them is it only takes one mistake. You could sell 10 properties and think you're the smartest guy in the world, and it just takes one mistake that you have, and you get sued by somebody and. You're going to wish you had some representation in between. Okay. So just kind of think through that. The other thing is remember that the listing agents, when you guys go out as sellers and you say, okay, hey, Mr. Listing Agent, I'm going to pay you X and we'll deal with the buyer side with the contract. There's a chance that there are now more unrepresented buyers that come to the table, meaning that, hey, I'm going to try to, if I'm walking up and I'm buying a $500,000 property and my buyer's agent just asked me to stroke him a check for 15 grand. I may think, okay, I'm as smart as that person. I'm going to go about this on my own. So remember that your listing agent on that side could end up doing twice as much work to put the deal together because they still have a fiduciary responsibility to you to make it happen, whether the other agent or or the other side of the transaction knows what they're doing or not. Okay. Their job is still to make it happen. So they could end up doing a lot more work on your behalf, especially if the other side is unrepresented or people start on the buy side, start doing, paying for paralegals to just review contracts and stuff like that, but there's no true representation on that side. So just things to think about and realize that, the value that your real estate partners do have for you and that they're vested interest in protecting you from legal issues and other things that could come up during the course of a transaction. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're splitting up your commission numbers, et cetera, that some of these things could happen. And so you have to keep in mind that they probably need to be compensated for that depending on what's happening. All right, so let's go through the buy side next. What does it mean for buyers? Well, we're not really sure yet. We just know there's going to not be a comfortable conversation between the buyer's agent and the buyer, and it's probably going to freak most buyers out because they've never had to deal with what happens in the commission number if I can't bury it in the price of the house. So those are all things that kind of, are things to think about. Originally, when this ruling came out, there was some concern about this buy-side commission being on the buyer's lap and what would happen with seller concessions, because on the lending side, there's seller concession limits. You can't just pay an unlimited amount toward the buyer's cost. So if these numbers were going to be allocated, so for example, on a 3% down loan on conventional, for example, the maximum seller contribution is 3%. Well, 99.9% of the people coming in with 3% down need 3% in closing costs. So what was going to happen if now they had to use that 3% for, real estate commission and didn't have any money for closing costs now? And what was that going to do to the transaction? So one thing that happened with clarification from all the agencies, meaning Fannie, Freddie, FHA, VA, USDA, Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie, everybody doing loans said, hey, regardless of what the ruling was or whatever, we are still going to ignore real estate commission as part of the concession number. So the buyer is protected now in that front. And that was a big concern because there was no way that was going to work. So, and on VA, for example, the buyer specifically cannot pay real estate commission in the VA guide. So the whole thing was a wreck. So they did clarify that, and that's okay now. So I think from the buyer side, it's just having the conversation and negotiating a number that you're comfortable with as you move on. Now, one thing that's interesting is I think, a lot of investors, and this is where I think, potentially the agents on the buy side could have some struggles with their investor clients, is the investor clients that have done this a long time and that are finding their own properties through, Zillow on the MLS or whatever. And it's not like the agent's bringing them the property. In those situations, a lot of those, investors may choose to go solo because, and a lot of those investors have gotten real estate licenses in the past just to collect the buy side commission number that was on the table in the base contract. So now that they are able to, they're able to basically renegotiate the deal without having to, actually have the real estate license because there's no quote unquote commission on the table in that sense. They can just offer a lower amount and move on. They may choose not to renew their licenses. So there could be an amount of real estate licensee holders that are investors that just dump their licenses and don't pay the fees and don't do the CE anymore because it's probably questionable now with these new rules on if they really need it. So that's kind of something to think about. The big thing is the buyer broker agreements and really understanding as a buyer what you're signing. Okay, so how much is your negotiation, and understanding that you're going to have to pay it if you can't get it in the contract. And so the hard part about this is you're negotiating a number from both sides, the buyer side agent and the buyer, right? You're negotiating a number that you really don't know what you're negotiating. If you're just negotiating a piece of paper, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to pay that money and write a check. They're okay, historically and probably currently burying that into their contract, but nobody's going to want to write another check for 2%, 3% or whatever is on that piece of paper. So, if the commission can't be negotiated into your deal, you got to be prepared to pay that on the buyer side. So you're going to have a clear understanding with your buyer side agent of, hey, if we can't get this in the contract because of the house, the seller, or whatever, how's this thing going to work itself out? Because obviously the buyer doesn't want to get sued. The agent doesn't want to sue him. I mean, none of that does anybody any good. So definitely got to be aware of that. Now here's the dilemma. Well, there's like 50 dilemmas, but here's another dilemma that from the buyer side is that this buyer side commission situation could disqualify them or disqualify a property that maybe they're interested in just because they can't get the number to fit based on the financial setup of whatever the contract is and what the seller's perception is of how they're going to handle these numbers. So this could be, the biggest challenge out there is that you could end up in a house you really like that checks all the boxes for you and your family, but you just can't get the numbers to work, which, has historically been the problem too, if you can't get concessions or whatever. But now you're adding another component to it, depending on whether that seller has actually priced in those numbers or not. So just things to think about on this front, and work with your buyer's agents to come up with a number and a pathway that works for both of you, and just understand the pitfalls of that takes two to tango, and we're going to need a seller to help out with the transaction to make it work. So one question I get asked is, hey, what happens if the contract falls apart? I have a buyer broker agreement and my agent can't get paid. Well, technically, if you move on with the agreement and the contract, and you don't have the buyer broker commission included in that agreement, you would be responsible for those numbers. So, and here's the struggle with it is the DOJ stepped in a little bit over this NAR settlement, and one of the things they talked about was, hey, this buyer broker agreement, once you sign it, that's supposed to be kind of, rock solid, ironclad type of thing. And they don't want that thing reworked and jerry-rigged around. Otherwise, kind of what's worth the paper that it was written on. So I think that's problematic, though, because, everything's in negotiation, even in real estate historically, and even now, you can choose to lower commission, raise, commission, whatever. So I think it's going to be hard for them to step in and put a hard line, into that deal. like we talked about. So, I think there's going to be some flexibility to that. And there's going to have to be, because not all contracts at the time that you write them are going to, you're not going to know in this buyer broker agreement what you're even dealing with. So there's going to have to be some flexibility. I think the biggest issue that I've heard so far is more having to do with the moral dilemma than the contractual dilemma of the buyer broker agreement, meaning that real estate agents have a fiduciary responsibility, regardless of commission number, to provide whatever that service is to you. So one of the big problems is, and this example actually happened, I had one of my agents call me and this actually happened. So, they sign a buyer broker agreement, 3%, whatever, everybody's happy, great. First time home buyers, they have no money, they need seller concessions, you know the drill. Okay, so this happens, and then what we had is they find a property. Great. Can we go see it? Yeah. She calls the listing agent. Listing agent says, hey, the seller will 100% not pay buyer broker commission. So this has nothing to do with the net. This has nothing to do with anything. Just it has to do with the fact that they are just hard, fast, and steady on the fact that they're not paying anything called buyer side commission. They'll do concessions, but no buyer side commission. So now we have what's called a moral dilemma, because a real estate agent has a fiduciary responsibility to provide a service, regardless of the money that they make. So now she has to show the house. She can't not show it, really. I mean, she can make up a bunch of stuff, which I know sometimes agents do, and this and that and whatever, just to get out of it because they don't want to work for free, which I get. But that's it's technically a problem on paper. So now she shows it. They like it. They want to write an offer on it. She writes the contract. At this point, she's not getting paid. So where do you go with it? Because she has to sue them. They don't have the money. She doesn't want to do that, or she's never going to have a client again. So it's almost like now she's in a situation where she's got to do this deal for free. And there's nothing she can do about it, really. And so otherwise the buyers don't get the house, or they exhaust the buyer broker agreement, try to go to another agent. I mean, it's just a mess, right? So the whole thing falls apart and you end up working for free. So I just want to make sure that the buyers out there that are watching this is not just a hammer your buyer's agent scenario. There's a very real possibility that whatever you negotiate on paper never comes to fruition for them, no matter what the number is, or the number ends up less because the contract doesn't allow for you to get in it and for them to get paid whatever that number is on that paper. So just kind of keep that in mind, that a lot of these agents are going to do a lot of work for you on the buyer side, and they really don't know if they're getting paid. Okay. And I think that's going to force some agents out of the business because people aren't going to run their lives that way. But you wouldn't go to work at Intel and go, well, hopefully I'm an engineer and they're going to pay me after 2 weeks. I mean, if you didn't know the money was coming, you wouldn't show up. So it's kind of the same thing for them. So just kind of keep that in mind, that they have some risk on their side. And so you guys really need to work through and talk about some things and just realize, hey, we may lose a house that we really like, but that's a part of the transaction. If you sign a buyer broker agreement, it's no different than wanting a house that has a roof on it and an air conditioner, right? It's part of your transaction, and you have to approach it as such that you may lose certain properties that might be in the right neighborhood, might be in the right school district, but if it doesn't have an air conditioning unit and the roof's falling in, there's a crack in the foundation, you're not buying it. Well, it's the same thing. If you can't fit your finances to make this work, you may have to pass on a property and go find a different one. So, hopefully that helped you guys understand kind of a little bit about what was going on. This is a very, very complicated topic, and the information is fluid as it goes through. So hopefully this helped you. All my information's in the description below. If you haven't already, please subscribe, share the video for anybody else that's confused as hell like we are. And we'll see you on the next one.